All right, so today we're diving into a pretty heavy topic, capital punishment. You know, the death penalty. We've got some interesting sources to guide us today. We've got Wikipedia for like a general overview,
Uh-huh.
and then we've got a recent article from The Week that explores both sides of the argument. And then, this is a really powerful one, we've got a BBC story about a man who was wrongly executed in Ireland back in the 1940s.
Yeah.
One thing that really stood out to me, even before we got started, is that over 70% of the world's countries have abolished the death penalty.
Wow.
But here's the thing. Over half of the world's population
Yeah.
still is in countries where it's practiced.
It's really fascinating, isn't it? It really speaks to just how complicated the global landscape is surrounding this issue. You have this movement towards abolition, yet in many parts of the world, the death penalty remains very entrenched.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. So to really understand where we are now, I think we need to go back in time a little bit. Wikipedia takes us way back and shows that the death penalty is not exactly a new thing. It seems like almost every civilization throughout history has used it in some way.
It's true. I mean, you find it in ancient codes, tribal laws, empires rising and falling. They were all using the death penalty. And for various offenses, too. It really makes you think about how societies throughout time have grappled with justice and punishment.
Well, speaking of ancient codes,
Yeah.
we got to talk about the Code of Hammurabi.
Right, of course.
Almost 1800 BC. And they were literally laying down the law.
And not just any law. What I think is so fascinating about Hammurabi's code is what it reveals about the social hierarchy of the time. Punishments weren't always equal, the wealthy, the elite. They often got off easier than commoners who committed the same crimes.
So even back then, it wasn't just about what you did, but also about who you were in society. Wow.
It really makes you wonder how much has actually changed. It's a question worth thinking about. And also the idea of an eye for an eye, which emerges around this time. That becomes like a cornerstone for arguments in favor of capital punishment. That persists even today.
Yeah, it's crazy how some ideas just echo through history. Like the Torah, the foundation of Jewish law. It includes provisions for capital punishment. But even though those laws were there, executions seem to have been rare. Why do you think that is?
That's a good question. And it just shows that, legal codes don't always reflect how justice is actually carried out. There's often a disconnect between what's written down and what actually happens in practice. Social norms, religious interpretations, political considerations, they all come into play.
It's like the law sets the rules.
Yeah.
But then there's this whole other layer of human judgment and context that influences things.
Yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And if we fast forward to ancient Greece, we see familiar names popping up. Protagoras, Plato, Aristotle. They were all studying the ethics of capital punishment back then, Were executions meant to be just about retribution, balancing the scales? Or were they more about trying to prevent future crime? Or even about purifying society, it seems like. They were asking the same big questions that we're still asking today.
It's incredible how these ideas from centuries ago still resonate with the arguments we hear today.
Yeah.
It just shows that this whole debate about the death penalty, it's woven into Western thought.
Yeah, it really is. And, as we look back through history, we see that the death penalty, while always present, it wasn't static. The range of crimes that were considered punishable by death has changed a lot.
Yeah, originally it seems like they used it for everything, like literally everything. But nowadays, it's mostly reserved for the most serious crimes.
Yeah.
In those countries that still practice it.
Exactly. Think murder, terrorism, treason. In a lot of parts of the world, we've seen a narrowing of application.
And that brings us to sort of a turning point, the abolition movement. Wikipedia says that 108 countries have gotten rid of the death penalty completely, and a lot more have moratoriums. So they've paused executions. Or they only use it in very specific situations. It really does feel like a global shift.
It does. And this movement gained a lot of steam after World War II, maybe because of a growing awareness of human rights and a rejection of state-sanctioned violence.
It's inspiring to see how some countries were ahead of their time on this. Tahiti got rid of the death penalty way back in 1824.
Wow.
And get this. Michigan became the first U.S. state to do so in 1846.
That's a great example of how change can start small and grow over time. It shows how powerful ideas can be and how they can spread and influence policies across continents.
It really does. And speaking of influencing policy, the European Union made abolishing the death penalty an entry requirement. Talking about putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, the EU's stance has definitely had an impact. A lot of countries that wanted to join, they got rid of the death penalty to try to align with those European values and standards.
So there's this clear trend towards abolition. But Wikipedia also points out a pretty harsh reality. Most countries in Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean still have the death penalty.
Yeah, and when you look at the numbers, it's striking. In 2022, the top 3 countries doing executions were Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China.
It's a reminder that despite all the progress that's been made, there's still a large part of the world that has very different ideas about justice and punishment. And the U.S. is kind of an outlier among developed nations. We're still actively using the death penalty. It's a very controversial issue, with strong arguments on both sides.
It really is. And before we get into those arguments, I think it's important to look at a real-life example. You brought up that BBC article about Harry Gleeson, a man who was wrongly executed in Ireland. I think it really highlights the human cost of this system.
Yeah, that story really got to me. So for those who haven't heard it, Harry was an Irish farm laborer who was wrongly convicted and executed back in 1940. It wasn't until 2015, after years of his family fighting for him, that the Irish government finally pardoned him.
And that pardon, it was a long time coming. I mean, it was acknowledging the huge injustice he suffered. And it shows that the justice system can make mistakes, even when someone's life is on the line.
And the part that really gets me is that in 2024, they dug up his body and they gave it back to his family so they could bury him properly. They even brought his fiddle along.
Wow.
It's such a powerful image,
Yeah.
like trying to give back dignity and honor to someone who was so wrongly accused.
It just underlines the fact that a wrongful execution, it's not just a statistic, it's a human tragedy, and it can impact families for generations.
It makes you think about all the other Harry Gleesons out there, people whose stories we might never know. It's a scary thought.
It really is, and it's something to keep in mind as we talk about the bigger arguments surrounding the death penalty.
Okay, so let's get into those arguments then. The Week article does a good job laying out both sides. What are some of the main points from the people who support the death penalty?
Well, they often talk about public support as a reason. Like in the U.S., polls show most Americans still support the death penalty for murder. But support has been going down in recent years.
Yeah, you hear that eye for an eye thing a lot. If someone takes a life, they should lose theirs too. There's that gut feeling of wanting justice.
It's a powerful idea, based on a desire for a retribution. Like the punishment should match the crime. But is revenge really the same as justice? And what about the families of people who were wrongly executed? Don't they deserve justice too?
That's a good point. What about the idea that the death penalty stops crime from happening? Does it actually make society safer?
That's where things get a little less clear. Supporters say that the fear of being executed will stop people from committing serious crimes. But when you look at the research on whether that's true, it's mixed.
So there's no clear evidence that it works that way.
Not really. And that's one of the main things that opponents of the death penalty bring up. They say it doesn't actually lower crime rates. They also point to the very real risk of executing the wrong person, like in Harry Gleeson's case.
Yeah, that risk is terrifying. The Death Penalty Information Center said that at least 200 people on death row in the U.S. have been exonerated in the last 50 years. 200 innocent people who could have been executed if new evidence hadn't come up or there hadn't been legal challenges.
That really makes you question whether the system can accurately decide who's guilty, especially when you can't undo an execution. And besides the risk of executing the wrong person, opponents also bring up racial and social biases in how the death penalty is used. And they say it costs a lot of money.
Yeah, the Week article mentioned those things. Can you talk more about that?
Sure. Studies in the U.S. have shown that people who kill white victims are more likely to get the death penalty than those who kill black victims. This suggests there's a bias in the system that goes against the idea of equal justice for all.
And about the cost. It actually costs more to execute someone than to keep them in prison for life. Why is that?
It's mainly because of all the appeals that happen and the crazy legal costs of death penalty cases. These cases can go on for years, sometimes decades, and that means huge bills for taxpayers.
So you've got these arguments going back and forth, strong feelings on both sides. But then you look at how things are worldwide, and it gets even more interesting. Support for the death penalty really varies from country to country. We talked about the EU earlier. But even the UN has called for a worldwide pause on executions.
Right, and those UN resolutions, even though countries don't have to follow them, they show that more and more countries are thinking that the death penalty goes against basic human rights.
But there are still places, like Japan, where a lot of people support the death penalty. But here in the U.S., support seems to be going down, especially among younger people. What do you think about that?
That generational difference is definitely something to watch. Younger people tend to question the death penalty more, and they're more open to other types of punishment, They're also more focused on fixing the problems in the justice system.
We saw that with the Troy Davis case in the U.S. There was a lot of international outcry against his execution. And a lot of that was driven by online activism and anger among young people.
Exactly. And I think social media will keep playing a big role in these debates, especially as younger people who are really connected online become more involved in politics.
It's like the death penalty is being put under a microscope, with technology and social media showing all the complicated and contradictory parts of it.
I think that's a great way to put it. This debate is far from over. It'll keep changing as we deal with new technologies, shifting social norms, and a growing understanding of human rights.
So we've got this complex mix of things happening: technology, social media, changing attitudes, and the age-old moral questions about life, death, and justice. That's a lot to take in, but I feel like I understand things a lot better now.
Me too. And that's what this is all about, isn't it? To grapple with these tough questions and to be able to have more informed and thoughtful discussions about the death penalty.
Absolutely. We started by going way back in time, looking at how the death penalty has been used throughout history and how the reasons for using it have changed over time.
Right.
Then we talked about how the abolition movement has changed things globally and how it's led to fewer countries using capital punishment. But we also talked about the fact that a big chunk of the world's population still lives under the threat of the death penalty.
And we talked about the fact that a big chunk of the world's population still lives under the threat of the death penalty.
We dug into the arguments for and against it too. We heard from people who think it stops crime and those who say it's all about revenge.
And then there are those who focus on the risk of getting it wrong and the biases in the justice system.
Yeah, and we talked about the emotional side of it too, thinking about the victims' families and what they go through, and also the whole idea of taking a life, even if it's in the name of justice.
It's been a really heavy conversation, but I think what stood out to me is how complicated this whole issue is. There's so much to think about: the history, the legal stuff, the moral questions, what's happening around the world, the role of technology. You can't just say it's right or wrong.
I agree. It's not that simple.
And that's why it's so important to have these kinds of conversations, to really explore all the different sides and question what we believe. It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of it all, but I think we need to look at it critically and be informed.
I think hearing those real-life stories has helped me a lot. Like the case of Harry Gleason. It reminds us that there are real people behind all the statistics and legal arguments, people whose lives are changed forever by this system.
Absolutely. And it makes us face the very real possibility of making a mistake, of executing someone who's innocent. That's a burden no justice system should have to carry.
I completely agree. We also talked about the death penalty being used for juvenile offenders. Wikipedia mentions this crazy story from 1556 about this infant, the son of a woman named Peratine Massey.
What? An infant?
Yeah. Apparently he was executed because they believed he inherited his mother's moral stain. She was convicted of heresy.
Wow. That's just horrifying. It's hard to even fathom that kind of thinking.
I know. It's a stark reminder of how far we've come in some ways, but also how these deeply ingrained beliefs about punishment can persist for centuries.
It makes you wonder what future generations will think when they look back at our time and how we dealt with these issues.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, something that I've been wrestling with this whole time. Is the death penalty ever really the right thing to do? And what does it say about us as a society if we believe in taking a life for a life, even when there's a chance, even a small one, that we might be executing an innocent person?
That's a huge question, and I think it's one that we each have to answer for ourselves. And as a society, there are no easy answers. But I think if we look at the history, the facts, and the stories of the people affected by this issue, we can at least start to form our own informed opinion.
That's a great point. If you're interested in learning more about this, check out the sources we talked about: the Wikipedia article on capital punishment, the article from The Week that explores both sides, and the BBC story about Harry Gleason. Keep learning, keep thinking, and keep talking about this important issue. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And we talked about how some countries are actually moving away from using the death penalty for young offenders. But it's still happening in some parts of the world.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always linear, and that some deeply held beliefs about justice and punishment, they can be really hard to change.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about, something that's been on my mind throughout this whole conversation. Is the death penalty ever truly justifiable? And what does it say about us as a society? If we believe in taking a life for a life, even when there's a risk, however small, that we might be executing an innocent person.
That's the ultimate question, isn't it? It's one that each of us has to grapple with. Personally and as a society, there's no easy answer. But I think by looking at the history, the facts, and the stories of the people who have been affected by this, we can at least start to form our own opinions, opinions that are informed.
I couldn't agree more. If this deep dive has got you thinking, we encourage you to check out the sources we talked about today, the Wikipedia article on capital punishment, the article from The Week that looks at both sides of the issue, and that powerful story from the BBC about Harry Gleeson. Keep learning, keep thinking critically, and keep the conversation going. This is an issue that deserves our attention, our careful consideration, and our compassion. Thanks for joining us on this journey.